Hello everybody, welcome to TCOM 101 Online. This is Dr. Mike Gerhard, Ball State University, Department of Telecommunications, and this is online video number 15. Of course, we continue to cope with the global coronavirus pandemic. Okay, we're going to look back at this and see it as a very strange part of our world history, but someday soon, the end will be in sight, and hopefully things will get back to normal. Now, in this video, I want to continue our discussion of some of the legal and regulatory foundations of telecommunications. And specifically, I want to talk about three important landmark laws passed by the Congress of the United States. These are the Radio Act of 1927, the Communications Act of 1934, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. These are all very important fundamental pieces of legislation that affect the telecommunications worlds. Now, 1927, 1934, and 1996 are the key dates to remember here. So let's talk first about the Radio Act of 1927. This was the very first big important law governing, regulating the telecommunications industries in the United States. The Radio Act of 1927 was passed really to bring order into the early days of broadcasting. Radio went into its popular stage in the 1920s, and there was a bunch of confusion. People were putting up stations on whatever frequencies they wanted and operating at different powers, and there was a lot of chaos and confusion in the airwaves. So in order to bring order to this chaotic situation, Congress passed the first important law governing broadcasting called the Radio Act of 1927. An important law, okay? And some of the elements of this law are still very much in effect today, the Radio Act of 1927. So let's look at this law a little bit more. Here's some of the main things I want you to remember about the Radio Act of 1927. The first thing it did was establish a regulatory agency called the Federal Radio Commission. This was the first federal regulatory agency set up to oversee the TCOM industries in the United States. Now, the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, didn't last very long, only a few years. It evolved into the Federal Communications Commission. Okay, so the Federal Radio Commission was the forerunner for the FCC. Okay, this law was important because it really imposed order on a very chaotic situation. Like I said, people were throwing up radio stations and there was a lot of interference and confusion and clutter. And so the government decided the role of the Federal Radio Commission was to impose order. How? By allocating the frequencies, by coming up with a plan to determine who would be able to use which frequencies for what purposes. And this imposed important order on the early radio industry. Another thing that the Radio Act of 27 did was declare that the airwaves are public, the electromagnetic energy that we're surrounded with, that this is a public resource, like a national resource, and nobody could own the airwaves. Now, the government can give an entity a license in order to use those airwaves, a temporary mandate to use the airwaves, but ultimately the airwaves belong to the public. Now, the Radio Act of 1927 also created something called the public interest requirement. It said to the radio stations, go ahead and use our public airwaves, but there's a string attached. You must operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. You must serve the public interest. And this requirement is still attached to the licensed radio and TV stations. They are required and they have to demonstrate that they're serving the public's interest. So the Federal Radio Commission, of course, not much diversity, a bunch of white guys back then, but it did establish the precedent for government regulation. Now, a few years later, Congress passed the next major law, the Communications Act of 1934, passed during the Great Depression and signed into law by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Communications Act of 34. Very important law because it created the Federal Communications Commission. Okay? This is the law that established the Federal Communications Commission, which is the main regulatory body that governs TCOM in the United States. Now, the Communications Act of 34 incorporated all the major elements of the Radio Act of 1927. Okay, it continued the precedent that the government could control the frequencies and that it could give licenses, and stations had to operate in the public interest, and the airwaves belonged to the public. All of that was incorporated into the next major law, the Communications Act of 34. But the law also expanded the functions of the regulators. For example, it put something called common carriers under the FCC's control. Common carriers, we'll talk about these, but these are widely used communication services like the telephone or the telegraph. Right? Common carriers were put under the jurisdiction of the FCC. And another interesting and important part of this law, the Communications Act of 1934, is that it started to require stations to give equal opportunity for political candidates, to make sure that there was balance in all the political communication. This portion of the law says that all legally qualified candidates for an office have to be given the same opportunity to purchase advertising. All right, a little bit more on the notion of common carriers. The Communications Act of 34 extended the FCC's jurisdiction to include the common carriers. So these are the services required to serve the general public on demand at reasonable prices without any discrimination. So think about the telephone or the postal service. Everybody should be able to use the service. It should be low cost, kind of universally available, and nobody should be able to censor your telephone communication. Okay, the idea of a common carrier. Now, more recently, people have tried to apply this concept to the internet and say it should be treated as a common carrier, although the Trump administration has reversed that idea. All right, Section 315. This is an important part of the Communications Act of 34 because it deals with political communication. This is also called the equal time provision. Section 315 of the Communication Act of 34 is that part of the law which requires the broadcasters and the cable operators to give equal time, to treat legally qualified political candidates equally when it comes to selling or giving away airtime. And again, this is to make sure that there's a balance in the political communication in our society, to make sure that the owners of radio or TV stations don't give an advantage to one candidate over the other. And so the Federal Communications Commission has grown since the 1930s to become a big bureaucracy which oversees now all aspects of telecommunications in the United States. All right, hang in there. I hope you're doing okay. That's an overview of the Radio Act of 27 and the Communications Act of 1934. Now, I want to introduce you to the next major piece of legislation, and that was the TCOM Act, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This was the first omnibus TCOM law in more than 60 years. Omnibus means a catch-all, comprehensive, ginormous, huge, a huge law, a house of many rooms. So the TCOM Act of 1996 was the first big overhaul of the TCOM laws since the Communications Act of 1934. I suppose by the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the great digital shift, the lawmakers and others looked around and determined it was definitely time to update some of the laws as we started to roar into the digital age. Okay, so the TCOM Act of 1996 is very important because it established the rules under which the TCOM industries in the United States could operate. Again, the TCOM Act of 1996 is the latest in a series of omnibus or landmark giant legislation. So all the essentials of the Radioactive 27 and the Communications Act of 1934, most of the essential elements of those are still in effect. They haven't been replaced completely by the TCOM Act of 1996. The airways still belong to the public, and stations are still required to give equal opportunity to political candidates. But anyway, let's take a closer look at the Telecommunications Act of 1996, this massive piece of legislation. First thing I want to do is look at the aim or the purpose of the act. If you dig it up and actually read the law and look at the top of it, it starts off with the aim or the purpose. So this is very important. Now, I will tell you the law itself might not always accurately reflect the aim or the purpose of the law because it's big, it's complicated, and in some ways the TCOM Act of 1996 is paradoxical. Okay, we'll explain that in a few minutes. But anyway, think about the aim or the purpose of the act and see if you agree with it. So the aim of the TCOM Act of 1996 was to promote competition. Well, yes, this is capitalism. Of course, we love competition. We think that it results in good things like lower prices and better products and better services. So competition, that's a hallmark of capitalism. So to promote competition and reduce regulation. Well, for several decades, people have been screaming about there's too much regulation, too much government regulation, red tape that handcuffs, strangles the business community in our country. So this has been an important cry for several decades in America to reduce regulation. So to promote competition and reduce regulation, why? In order to secure lower prices and higher quality services for American TCOM consumers. So yes, that's great, isn't it? We all want lower prices and higher quality service. So that's not all. Another aim of the act was to encourage the rapid deployment or rollout of new TCOM technologies. And we have certainly seen an explosion of emerging technology since the 1990s. Think about it. What if you could rewrite the aim of the TCOM Act of 1996, especially in light of some of the contemporary issues that we've talked about in this class? If you could write the major law governing the TCOM industries in this country, what issues would you include in such a law? What are your priorities and values? What's high on your agenda? I think there's a lot of important current issues that we could address if we were today writing the major law that covered the TCOM industry. What about the issue of the digital divide? How about data privacy protection, net neutrality, e-waste, concentration of ownership concerns, and other issues? Think about what issues you would include if you were in charge of writing the law of the land. Anyway, back to the TCOM Act of 1996. It changed the ground rules for competition and regulation in all sectors of telecommunications or the electronic communications industry. What are those sectors? Here's the four major areas. We've got the telephone industry, the cable television industry, the over-the-air radio and TV stations, and we've got the internet and the online services. So in those four areas, the TCOM Act of 1996 set forth some new regulations. In each of these areas, the idea was to stimulate competition. Okay? To stimulate competition and reduce regulation. So, in all of those areas, something called cross-market entry barriers were eliminated. I'll explain what this is, but these were basically rules that said a company couldn't cross over into new markets with new products and services, that they had to stay in their own lane. Well, these barriers were eliminated by the TCOM Act of 1996. The whole purpose was to try and unleash marketplace competition. Now, the law also relaxed some of the concentration and ownership rules, okay? It reduced some of the limits on ownership and allowed for more big media ownership. Now, that might be paradoxical in a way, because if the law was designed to promote competition, does it promote competition when you allow concentration of ownership and concentration and mergers to happen? All right, so look, the general thrust of the law was deregulation, getting rid of a lot of rules or relaxing a lot of rules. But paradoxically, on the other hand, the TCOM Act of 1996 put forth new regulations, especially in the areas of TV violence and online porn or indecent online communications. Congress set forth new rules. So the TCOM Act of 1996 was not just about deregulation. It also set forth new regulations that we'll talk about. Anyway, first let's talk about the phone companies like AT&T and Verizon, and how the phone industry was affected by the TCOM Act of 1996. In terms of telephone service, the law really allowed the phone companies to go way beyond the traditional old-fashioned dial tone that we would use to connect with another person on the phone. You know, the phone industry has gone from pots to pans, plain old telephone service to pretty amazing new services. Okay? So, the TCOM Act of 1996 allowed the phone companies to offer a bunch of new services, including video and internet services. So, phone companies now sell a variety of services, online, video, and telephony. You go to a phone company today and you can see that they're bundling a bunch of services together. But believe it or not, at one time, phone companies were told to stick in one lane, the phone lane. But now they're allowed to branch out and to offer a bunch of other services like high-speed internet and digital TV. Most of the video on digital TV delivered through the internet is something called Internet Protocol, or IPTV. This is just the idea of using the internet to receive video signals and other services via the internet connection, via your broadband connection. So when you're streaming, you're really watching IPTV. What about cable? The cable industries. For many years, cable is how a lot of Americans got their multi-channel video content, and millions of Americans still get their content through cable TV. Cable TV. How is it affected by the TCOM Act of 1996? Well, the cable companies, like the phone companies, were allowed to cross over into new markets and offer new services. So the cable companies, in addition to video, started to sell telephone and broadband internet services. If you think about it, the whole goal of this is to fire up a bunch of competition between the cable and the telephone companies. Okay? And we have seen a lot of competition between these service providers, especially in recent years. So again, just like the cable companies, the phone companies were allowed to branch out into new markets and start selling new services like cable TV and high-speed internet connectivity. All right. When we use the internet to make a phone call, we're really doing something called internet telephony. Okay? And that's based on something called VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol. So when we're doing, audio voice only telephone like service through the internet, we're using something called VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol. And like everything else on the internet, this is where information is set out in little packets and then reassembled at the other end, okay, as a normal kind of experience. Cable modem. The TCOM Act of 1996 allowed a new revenue stream for the cable companies, and that was just selling broadband connectivity. You can use the cable system to hook people up to the internet and to sell cable modem service, broadband internet connections sent through the cable TV system. Okay? And it's got a pretty good amount of bandwidth. It's very popular. For example, Xfinity. So, the TCOM Act of 1996, one of the major things to remember in terms especially of the cable and the phone industries is that these cross-market entry barriers were eliminated and allowed these companies, these industries to go out into new marketplaces and to start competing in new ways. So, the TCOM Act of 1996 had a huge impact on the phone companies and the cable TV providers. Okay? All of them have expanded their products and services. Okay? And they're in stiff competition right now for America's telecommunications consumer dollars. All right, that's all I've got in this video. I hope it was okay. I'm not having my best day, but that was a little introduction to the Radio Act of 27, the Communications Act of 34, and a beginning look at the TCOM Act of 1996. And we'll dig down on that law a bit more in the next video. So that's all for now. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon. Dr. Mike saying so long.